Welcome, this is Alex Bartholomew, one of your co-hosts. We're going to get the webinar going in approximately 1 minute. So if everyone can sit tight, we'll be with you in 1 minute. Thank you. Okay, we're getting some attendees. Okay, it's time to begin. So welcome, thank you for joining us today to talk about the common problems when implementing OKRs and how to overcome them. I'm one of your co-hosts, Alex Bartholomew. I'm the CEO of People Stretch Solutions. We are a management consulting firm based in the Washington, D.C. area here in the United States. We're lucky enough to have a global audience today. We focus on OKR consulting, sales effectiveness, and C-level advisory across North America and EMEA. And so joining us today is the CEO of one of our software partners who happens to be based in Germany. We're lucky to have their CEO, Henrik. Henrik, please introduce yourself for our listeners.
I'm Henrik, one of the founders, and as Alex said, also the CEO of Purdue, which is a goal management platform that covers both OKRs and KPIs. We started late 2014, and as we were building our software, we've learned that there's a lot of challenges that come with implementing OKRs, which is why we have this call today, first of all, and also why I've been writing a lot of content, which you find on purdue.com/resources, and as well as our YouTube channel.
Awesome, thank you for that. So our goal today is to have a rich discussion for Henrik and I to share some perspective of what we've learned implementing OKRs, so that all of you can continue in your OKR journey to get better and better. So let's start at the very beginning of why organizations engage in OKRs. Oftentimes, whether it's at an individual, team, or organizational level, there's challenges and there's the gap between strategy and execution. And that gap is widened between a lack of alignment, accountability, priorities, or even a global pandemic. So a lot of organizations right now are really struggling because the impact of going virtual, many of them were ill prepared. In addition to that, there's some organizations that don't do a very good job of disseminating strategic priorities. I have a great factoid from 2018 from MIT Sloan Business School. They surveyed across 5 years 125 enterprise companies, and you can see that after the executive team, even the top team wasn't that good. You'd think they'd be at 80 or 90%. And then when you went lower in the organization, there was very little visibility. So what's a company to do? In comes OKRs. And so our hope today is the structured goal framework that stands for O is for objectives, KR is for key results, that you're starting down this journey or you're close to considering it. So we're going to dig in, share some insights about some important areas that both Henrik and I feel passionately about, and hopefully you'll be able to walk away with some nuggets. So one of the powerful things about OKR and the structured framework is how it can help you get high alignment and accountability. So in the OKR cycle, there's 3 phases, and we, even Henrik and I, have different names for it, but basically there's at the beginning of a quarter, there's the strategic planning, which is generally about 2 weeks. Then there's the 10-week period, that's execution, and at the very end of the quarter, it's the retrospective. And so what we wanted to do and highlight were some key variables that we see companies commonly get wrong. So in the strategic planning phase, our graph here on the left, we've got 2 key variables, the number of teams and the number of conversations. So the trend that we see is that oftentimes leadership doesn't set the expectation for the number of teams and the amount of conversations. Henrik, what are you seeing in the strategic planning on these two variables? What challenges are you seeing, or are you seeing the same things?
I think you have a better insight into that because you're spending times at these organizations as you coach them through. As a software provider, I don't have those insights, but I do want to connect to one other thing that you mentioned. It slips my mind again. I can't remember. Anyways, regarding the, it will come up later on. Regarding the number of teams and the number of conversations, I mean, from my experience, sometimes it also goes down, right? So the number of conversations doesn't go up together with the number of teams as they are increasing, and the average conversations per team are actually decreasing, and a lot less information is being shared. Like, information continues to be shared within certain silos and within a particular team. But yeah, as you saw on the previous slide, information doesn't trickle down from the top anymore. So you miss that strategic direction and that guidance as you start planning the execution for your strategy.
Great, and I think that's great that you highlighted that you've actually seen a lot of teams participate, but unfortunately there weren't a lot of conversations to go with that. So that's a missed opportunity. So depending on what role you play in your organization, whether you're thinking about this or you've begun the journey, these are two variables that you really need to think about early in the strategic planning cycle. And you really want to think about that even before it starts, so that way you can engineer the right outcome. So now you're in execution mode. And the two variables that we've seen that we'll talk a little bit more about is the frequency of team reviews and the frequency of one-on-ones. Henrik, I know that you told us a little bit about a research project. Love to get your insight on what you've seen in terms of the frequency and the impact it has on adoption.
Yeah, and now I also remember what I wanted to say, connected to something that you said earlier. But it is confusing, and I can totally imagine it is confusing for our audience, is the different terminologies that are being used by different softwares, by consultants, and the content on the internet. So sometimes you are talking about the same, you just don't realize it because different players in the field might use different terms. So if anyone wants to pick it up to create like a central agreement where we all say these are the terms that we adhere to, I think that would be in everyone's benefit. Coming back to your questions regarding OKR team reviews, like that will be a particular term that you could say, okay, what does that mean, right? Different organizations have different approaches towards that. I know that we'll talk about this a little bit later in the webinar, but the insight that I wanted to share here is that as you have more check-ins with your OKRs, be it a review, be it a progress update, in our research amongst our customer base, we have been able to connect that to goal attainment. So as you have more of these progress meetings, team review meetings, we do actually see in our data that the companies that do that well achieve a lot more of their goals that they've set out to achieve versus the companies that don't do that.
That's great. And certainly we see the same correlation, and that's why we've laid it out. It's really easy as a team, whether it's the leadership team or a departmental team or even a team within a department, you have to be careful of balancing the review, but the common mistake we see is that companies just don't do it frequently enough. And we'll talk a little bit more about the relationship between the team review and the one-on-one. So that takes us to the retrospective, and the variables we wanted to really get people to think about is that in a retrospective, you're supposed to, at the end of every quarter, look back and hopefully celebrate the wins and learn from them, as well as celebrating or learning from the losses, and were they learning opportunities. So Henrik, what are you seeing from retrospectives on these two fronts?
I think they're extremely powerful, and there's a lot of data to back that up. Also, I mean, there's this thing from the army that soldiers are forced to pause and reflect before they engage in battle. Like there's really important reasons for you to do so. Doing these retrospectives, that's the moment where you capture your learnings. So whether you've achieved an OKR or not, by doing a retrospective, you will make sure that you capture a learning from that OKR. So you may not have achieved it, but by doing a retrospective, at least you get something out of it, because each learning is also a step forward for the organization, or can be a step forward for the organization. So knowing that, I'm surprised how few companies actually do that well. And I mean, what we've seen is that, I mean, this is something that I don't think you should run through a software. I think this is something that you should do in person together with your entire organization or with your department, depending on your size, of course. But yeah, I mean, to do this well, I think you need to set the expectations right, take your time for it, and make it very clear to people why we're doing it. Because I see a lot of companies starting with it, and then after doing 2 or 3 retrospectives, like, they don't see the point of it anymore, and they sort of drop it, which is a waste. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I literally was in a retrospective yesterday, and the organization decided to be a little proactive because they wanted to start planning to get ahead on the next quarter. So we did the retrospective. And so there were a couple of bright young leaders who didn't see the value, because I spoke to them after, and they didn't necessarily see the value of the learning opportunity. And the challenge is, for a lot of organizations, it's the pressure of work building up. And do we have to do this meeting? I couldn't agree more with Henrik, and this learning opportunity where you get to reflect and really look back at the entire quarter. A lot of times we see a good practice just from executive performance that people are reflecting weekly. Sometimes people might think back over an entire month, but we rarely see consistency in doing retrospective unless you operate and live in an agile software development. Agile's done an amazing job of creating visibility around this practice. So that's definitely something that we want to point towards as some inspiration to get more organizations to be agile and to do retrospectives.
Just to, because I think, to set this entire webinar in perspective, so both Alex and we are both focused on using OKRs to bridge the strategy execution gap, to implement and execute your strategy. And maybe, I'm not sure, Alex, but it could be that some companies don't do retrospectives because they use OKRs more for people management, which happened a lot at the beginning, but we do see a trend now happening over time where our companies are using more and more the OKRs for strategy execution. And if you use it for people performance management, then maybe you do these retrospectives in like a performance review, which is a completely different topic than what we are talking about today. And if you use OKRs to execute the strategy of the organization, then these retrospectives are super important for the business, because that's what pushes the business forward.
So that's a great point. And actually, so to give even more context, Henrik is software, I'm service, I'm a coach. I go in and I work with people. Now, one of the things I will say to add to what you just shared is that I don't think the two things you mentioned have to be exclusive, mutually exclusive of one another. I actually think they're very related, but I think companies sometimes don't do the best job of managing this. So we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to team reviews and one-on-ones. So let's dig in on an area that people start when they're thinking about OKRs, or they've started and they've struggled. A lot of focus is around the writing of the OKR. And on a top level, we've seen that a lot of times objectives need to inspire as many teams as possible. And the challenge that a lot of organizations face is that either they're narrowly written or they focused on just one or two. And so not everyone was able to engage because not enough, or they just weren't, they were too narrowly written. So Henrik, I'm curious, because people are entering these into your system, what trends do you see in terms of how top level objectives are written and some of the pitfalls?
Yeah, so the word inspire means that it triggers other people and other teams to take action. And for that, it's really important that the top level objectives are, first of all, easily understood by everybody in the organization. So you can have a very narrow, you can have a very broad objective, But if people don't understand what the organization means by it, it's not going to have the effect that you desire. So that's something. This is also why you have the objective, right? I mean, if you could also work with just key results maybe, but key results tend to be could be technical. There's metrics that you find in key results that maybe not everybody in the organization understands, but you put an objective above it to sort of theme these key results that you're working on. And the objective should be the object that people could look at and that everybody in the organization, regardless which team they're in, should be able to understand. Not just from top level company down to the rest of the organization, but I think this also matters in between teams. It could be relevant for engineers to understand what objectives the sales team is working on, or what objectives a product team or a marketing team is working on, and vice versa, of course. So by making sure that it's easily understood, that's when people can actually take action. And by making sure that they are taking action, I think you have to make sure that the objective is relevant for them. And the way we do that through our software, for example, is that we always ask people to answer 2 questions when creating an objective. Why is it important, and why is it urgent? I mean, this is related to that famous Eisenhower matrix. They say, okay, when is something a priority? And then you have importancy on one X, and you have urgency on one X, and you focus on the things that are important and urgent first. But by answering these questions, you're sort of forcing people to back up the objective and justify why this is a priority at this moment for the organization. And other benefits of that is that it usually also forces people to then back up the objective with data. If I ask you, why is this objective important to you, Alex, then you'll probably come up with a few data points that you found that are then justifying why these are problems that need to be fixed right now. So it also helps your organization to become more data-driven that way.
Yeah, so for example, one of my objectives today is Henrik was nice enough to join us in spite of having a flight to catch immediately after. So my objective is to have a great webinar and get you en route to the airport on time.
Yes, thank you very much.
In 40 minutes, so that's great. So important takeaway, 2 questions, 2 great introspective questions. Why is it important, and why is it urgent? Oftentimes, questions as simple as that aren't being asked. So the next point we want to kind of highlight is that, and I mentioned this a little bit when we had our graphs, is that, you know, leadership must encourage OKR conversations early and often. And so organizations just aren't used to talking about strategic things at all levels with the frequency that OKR demands. So that's a change management effort that everyone needs to understand. So the problem is that because the organization didn't make that clear, then you have not enough conversation happening, and you start seeing maybe a little bit of misalignment as something gets cascaded down, and you just don't see the effectiveness. Henrik, from your perspective, you know, have you seen maybe in the last year or 2, have you seen companies getting better at this, or is this still potentially a challenge when you get down to L2, L3, and the objectives are being pushed down in one organization?
I think across the board, organizations worldwide have become better with OKR, just in general. There's still many challenges, and I mean, that's also why OKR consultancy has become a lucrative business for you, probably. But there are still many challenges, but I do think across the board, things are definitely improving. And the reason is that OKR clearly has gone mainstream. When we launched early 2015, there were, I mean, mostly smaller organizations, tech companies, but now we really get interest from across the world, from very conservative industries all the way to, yeah, the tech industry is still very relevant, of course, but also all the way up from very small companies at the start, all the way up to huge stock list companies nowadays. So I do think there's a lot more content, there's a lot more discussions happening, also between people that work both at a company that works with OKR. So I do think that learning curve is rapidly increasing. When it comes to the conversations, still a major challenge, I think. And yeah, what I think is an easy solution for this is to embed OKRs in the meetings that you already have. So if you have one-on-ones with between managers and direct reports, that's a great opportunity to talk about goals. If you do have an all hands with your organization, that's a great opportunity to look at the objectives that the organization is working on. If you have team meetings, and by embedding OKRs in the meetings that you already have, you're not creating new meetings for the organizations. Typically, people don't like having more meetings than they already have. And it's a very, very simple and very clean way to make sure that that you keep bringing up the goals that you set for your organization, and you continue to have discussions for them. And I think, as you mentioned yourself, it's highly important. It keeps them top of mind, make sure people stay focused on it, make sure people continue to understand why are we doing this. And these are things just like strategy. You can't just set it once, communicate it once. These are things that you that you constantly have to reinforce in the organization to really make it work well.
Questions, Henrik, that's great. So we got a couple questions about this, and so I want to answer them because I think this is a good point. So the questions are, can you talk about accountability and decision making? You know, do they need to be on the same level? And then the second question from a different participant talks about L1 and L2 decision making needs to be at the same level as well, and if it isn't, then accountability needs to be higher. So here's something that's very important about a precursor to accountability. You cannot have accountability if you do not have commitment. And in order to have conversation tends to drive alignment. And a lot of times, if there isn't a conversation, so Henrik just talked about this, and I want to highlight, if an organization wants the accountability, they have to ensure that the conversation is happening, that alignment is a result of the conversation, and then the leaders need to decide where decision-making will take place. So that's a very important part of the whole process. And part of the decision-making is in the strategic planning part of every quarter, you finalize an OKR. And as you finalize an OKR, that's where you anchor decision-making, whether the decision is going to be made at the highest level or if it's being pushed down to a department or a team. So through this process, you're not going to get clarity on commitment or decision-making if there hasn't been the appropriate level of discussion. Henrik, do you agree with that, or is there anything else you want to add before we move on?
No, I fully agree to what you say. I mean, I think, yeah, no, I have nothing to add to that. I fully agree.
Okay. Okay, someone just hit with another quick one. Can we talk about accountability and decision-making across functional OKRs? So I was just talking about this with my partner this morning. One of the things that people who are thinking about OKRs commonly ask are about how it can help in cross-functional teams. And one of the challenges that leaders that have people in the cross-functional team, they have to be aware that they have to, in some cases, arbitrate and make sure that they're getting with the collective leaders that represent people in that cross-functional team. So it's not just the cross-functional team having conversations to make sure that the objectives that are being set, their respective leaders need to spend a little bit of time talking about what resources might actually be at odds with one another. There could be one particular department that has 1/3 of the members of the cross-functional team, and the CEO is driving, that the ask of the CEO is so much, that person needs help. And so it's that conversation that needs to happen at the cross-functional level, not just at the team, but at the leaders that are managing people in that team. So that's very complex, but I hope that makes sense. All right, we're moving to the next item.
I've one thing to add to that. So we're talking, so the question is, can you talk about accountability and decision making and cross-functional OKRs? But the way we deal at that internally at Purdue, but also in the software, is that for each objective that you create, you need to do two things to make sure the objective will be achieved. It's make someone responsible and keep that person accountable. So we called it a lead, but I guess other organizations have different terms for it. But for every goal that you enter into our product, whether it's a KPI or an objective, you need to assign a lead to it. And the lead is the person who's end responsible for that objective. That's the person who gives updates on that objective if anyone has a question. That's the person that is reviewing, like, are the key results progressing? Are we working on the right things to push the needle for these key results? And that, I think, is a very simple way to deal with accountability. Make sure that you assign it to someone, that someone is end responsible, and then you keep that person accountable throughout the quarter to make sure that you help that person, kind of like as a coaching role, to make sure that that person will achieve the OKR.
That's a great detail, because oftentimes with cross-functional teams, the leader is potentially not empowered. And so it's critical to ensure that if there is a lead, it's not just in name, but there is governance and empowerment to make sure that that person can, successful. So that's always tricky.
The saying goes, if multiple people are responsible, no one is responsible. So you need to make one person end responsible for that objective, and that solves the accountability problem.
Great. So the next item, now we're in execution mode again, and it's the notion of team transparency and mastering the weekly check-in. So whether you're having a team meeting at the highest level, department level, or team level within a department, you must look at OKRs with a level of frequency. And so the challenge that we see is that the frequency isn't there, and there's not an interplay between the team review and what's the discussion that's being had in the one-on-one. And so as a result, sometimes people feel reporting's a burden, sometimes employees aren't getting the right feedback because they're not looking at the OKRs frequently enough, or trying to manage the relationship between those two kind of channels of looking at it. So really want to highlight that depending on where you are in your OKR journey. So Henrik, from your perspective, in doing the research, is there a cadence that you recommend for looking at OKRs at a team level versus on a one-on-one level?
No, so the research that we've done was more related to the progress updates, and there the optimal cadence was a weekly cadence. So I mean, you mentioned it at the start already, but you typically use the first week of a quarter to set the OKRs, and then you have around 10 weeks to work on it, and then you have the retrospective and the closing process starts. So by doing like a weekly, we call it a check-in, but it's a weekly check-in with all the goals that you're responsible for. And by doing that once a week, you have 10 opportunities throughout the quarter to see how you're progressing and correct course where you need to correct course.
So I want to really highlight that, very important, okay? So at People Stretch, we do a lot around behavior and emotional intelligence. And when Henrik just talked about the opportunity to do 10 check-ins, and he's using the term check-in or in terms of entering information on a Friday afternoon into the OKR. So those are the moments that we're hoping that a leader, a manager, or a frontline person is actually reflecting on the progress that they made on their objective and key results. And so having 10 consecutive opportunities to look at that reinforces the right behavior and really keeps a focus on, was this person engaged and on top of that? And, you know, I know that Henrik is the CEO of the software company. I'll give him a shameless plug. His software does a great job of capturing that information, and that's the reason for being for OKR software. So when you've got this, you really need to give that some thought. Henrik, anything else to add in terms of that progress check-in and the power of it?
Yeah, so we disconnect the progress updates. We call that check-in, but here you go again. We're talking about different terms. So we really need, Alex, apart from this webinar, we really need to start working on that and put something together to make that all a lot simpler for everyone. But we disconnect the progress updates from like a review and a one-on-one, because as you go into a one-on-one or a review, that's not the place where you want to update progress. That's where everything should be up to date. So we ask people to do like a weekly check-in, to have those 10 opportunities that you're reminded of your goals, to stay focused on it and have the chances to correct course where needed. And then we recommend them to embed them in a one-on-one that managers and direct reports probably already have, where you can then review the check-in of a person, see how they've progressed in the previous weeks, and then have a short conversation around that. And in that, that's like the individual level review. And there, I think managers could benefit from acting as a coach for the people that report to them. At the moment they mark a goal as being off track, it's a great opportunity to have a conversation like, hey, why is the goal off track right now? Do you have a plan to get it on track again? Is there anything that you need from the organization, from me? Is there anything we can do to help? To have this joint feeling that we're all in this together, and coach the person towards successful achievement of the objectives that they are responsible for. And then to have transparency, I think a review on a team level or even on a company level is really good. You don't want to rely on people logging in and finding all that information out themselves. It's really good to have an all-hands meeting on department level, team level, again, depending on the size of your organization, where you share all that information with the entire organization. You can talk about progress, of the learnings that you've collected, etc. So that really boosts transparency, having that last type of meeting.
So one of the things that you mentioned that I want to hit before we move on is this notion of you don't want your one-on-ones to be status updates. You want it as a leader, manager, you want it to be a meaningful conversation. There should be feedback about the future. How are we working towards the future? Let's not look back. Technology has helped us cover that. Let's look forward. And if you're a manager or a leader, what value are you bringing in helping that person accomplish their objectives and key results? So I want to get to the last slide, just because this sparked some good conversation between Henrik and I yesterday.
It sure did.
It's the culture of stretch. It's the retrospective. And so one of the things that a lot of organizations that we work with is that they're very growth oriented, and they're really pushing people to set very ambitious objectives. But the challenge is they haven't done a good job of creating a culture where people feel safe enough to take a chance. People are scared to fail, and oftentimes, if you fall short, people don't handle accountability very well. And so that contributes to not getting any value out of the retrospective. Now, I know that, Henrik, you had some interesting thoughts on the whole notion of stretching and moonshots. Can you share those? Because I think they're very important to hear.
Yeah, so first of all, OKR does not equal stretch goals. So lots of times when people talk about OKRs, they use stretch goals or stretch targets in the same sentence. And I think, yeah, I mean, I've actually even heard sometimes from people that they said, like, yeah, we don't do OKR because ambitious targets and stretch goals, that's not for our organization. And I think that's absolutely ridiculous. There's so many benefits in OKRs and so many important things why organizations should work with OKRs. And I just think that stretch goals is not one of them. Stretch goals can also be complicated because you already have to set targets and probably more targets than you did before. And then you also have to stretch yourself, and how far do you stretch yourself? So when you're new to OKR, I would even say, like, ignore the whole stretch goals part and add that into the mix later, just to keep it simple as your organization gets started with OKRs. And the other thing that we found is that stretching is cultural. So Alex is based in the US, we're based in Europe, in Germany. And we see that American people are way more comfortable with setting very ambitious goals for themselves. I think Elon Musk is like the big example of that. Sets very ambitious targets for his organization, and then he almost never hits them. But the achievement that he does, the progress that he does have on that goal is still very, very impressive. But you get to 70, 80%, and I see in the US people are fine with that, whereas in Europe, people would then say, yeah, but I didn't achieve the goal. And they rather get to 120% and overachieve than to stretch themselves very far and then only get to 60, 70%, even though the actual results might be the same, right?
Absolutely. And so one of the things that I wanted to touch on that is I think I mentioned, as we were joking back and forth, that stereotype in the US, it's well deserved, but there's a surprising amount of people that feel the way you do that are very conservative. Now, one of the things that we always talk about when we're coaching and advising organizations to adopt OKRs is getting them to think about nurturing someone's sense of accomplishment. So there's a behavioral reason to start conservative. And we want to make sure that we nurture our employees' sense of accomplishment. And you can build on that. And so after you get a couple of quarters to maybe 3 quarters of OKR success, that's when I think a little bit of inspiration and aspiration need to come into the objective and or some of the key results. But what's important is that, I do a lot of running. It helps me keep my sanity. Not everyone wants to be a marathon runner. In the same vein, OKRs require a certain amount of discipline. And so in order for OKRs to work for an organization, every quarter, it's good at the end to celebrate, to remind people, this is why we did strategic planning. This is why we might have fallen short. As a company, we're growing, and this is how we learn. So there's the behavioral benefit of nurturing our sense of accomplishment, and then there's the additional behavioral benefit of learning. And nurturing sense of accomplishment and learning are huge motivators that give us the energy to go into the next quarter. So there's a very important behavioral hook that why a retrospective needs to be done. And so hopefully after hearing from both Henrik and I, you'll understand why it's important to do that. So we've got a question that I want to get to. There seems to be so many cultural organizational needs for OKR to be successful. Do you have minimum needs? And then I asked, because the company continually backtrack on OKRs as we discovered all our cultural and operational gaps that were undercutting our ability to be successful with OKRs. So here's the thing, OKRs are working. OKRs breeds transparency, so you can actually take ownership of those operational, cultural, institutional gaps. The larger a company becomes, the OKRs are going to shine a light on everyone. And so I think what's important is you have to manage expectations that OKRs are a tool that could potentially shine a light on those challenges. But there's definitely some things that certainly, Henrik, from your perspective, if a CEO came to you and said, what needs to be in place for us to be successful with OKRs at a minimum level, is there anything you would recommend to a CEO? Hey, you should think about OKRs. What kind of advice would you give to that CEO or organizational leader?
You should be comfortable with transparency. That's of course very important, because if you're going to set these OKRs and you don't feel comfortable sharing them with the rest of the organization, not per se related to OKRs, but also reflects to your strategy and any goal that you set in your business, but that's very important. And I think another very important criteria of success that we found is the buy-in and commitment from the entire leadership team. If there are like 1 or 2 people in there that are not sold on it and very skeptical about it, that will trickle down to the organization. And implementing OKR is essentially change management, and adapting to change is a challenge for every change that you go through. And if you don't see that this is fully backed by the leadership team, especially by the CEO, then it's not going to work. That commitment on that leadership level is absolutely important. Sorry, that was my alarm for my for my airport that I need to get to. Alex, I need to drop out, but I'll let you continue the conversation. There's 2 comments that came in about creating like a standard glossary of terms for the OKR industry. So I think we are obligated to our audience to really start picking that up and start working on that after this webinar. And there's one quick question that I also saw coming in. Can you talk about setting OKRs that you cannot yet track, and whether to delay the goal until tracking is built? I think that's a very interesting question, especially when organizations are new to OKR. As you set OKRs, you discover all these data gaps that you have in your organization. So it's very common that you set an OKR and then realize, hey, we actually don't know. We don't know why this is important. We don't know if the problem that we're trying to solve with this objective is actually existing in the company. And so you'll continue to have that, which is good to already start thinking about your next quarter's OKRs towards the end of the quarter, so that you have time to put that tracking in place. And sometimes when you do have that tracking in place, you need a bit of data, a few weeks, a few months maybe, in order to see if the problem is there. And if that's the case, you should of course delay the OKR then to the next quarter.
Oh,
And that's it from my end.
Because I know we're going to lose you. On that one in particular, it is important to differentiate organizational. Henrik, we're going to lose you.
Right? Yeah, so.
I'll continue.
Okay.
Safe flight. So I'm going to stay on and answer a couple more questions that just came in. So finishing up, a lot of organizations have metrics that come up and they have goals, and it's important to differentiate what is strategic and what is departmental. And there's a lot of ways that you can track the departmental. It is important to be careful not to clutter your OKRs with too many of these goals. So I would encourage that there's a lot of additional tools that you can use to track. Most OKR softwares are meant to get you focused on what matters the most. And then there's a question on alignment pitfalls and cross-vertical, cross-departmental in big companies. And so the key is it's mapping and understanding the stakeholders and really managing it at two levels, the actual cross-functional team, and unfortunately, the larger a company becomes, being able to navigate the political impact. And this, when I use the term political, it's about time and resources that each department that is connected to that cross-departmental, cross-functional team. And so you have to manage it at two levels. At the executive level, if you employ cross-functional teams, you should be choreographing this. When an organization stops choreographing that cross-functional conversation at multi-levels, that's a reason why large companies really start to struggle. And so there's no silver bullet. The larger a company becomes, and a lot of industries lend themselves to, for example, we've seen pharma, now that we've done a little bit of work in it, they do a lot cross-functional. Certainly technology from a development perspective, software development perspective, technology development, that requires cross-functional. And so it needs to be thought about at the team level, kind of that next level up, and then organizationally, there needs to be awareness when we engage in cross-functional. Do we have the right governance in place to make sure that those leaders are doing the best job possible? So hopefully we've done a good job of answering your questions. We're going to have a post-webinar email go out to everyone. If you'd like a copy of the recording, we're happy to provide it. Just shoot me an email. You'll see it on the screen, and you'll also see it in our follow-up email. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and we'll be signing off. Have a great rest of the week and get ready for a big fourth quarter. Take care, and signing off.